"That's not Daddy," she said. "It's somebody else." Then the shape tossed and bent under the wind, lifted the latch of the gate, and they could see that it belonged to a woman who was holding her hat on with one hand and carrying a bag in the other. As they watched, Jane and Michael saw a curious thing happen. As soon as the shape was inside the gate, the wind seemed to catch her up into the air and fling her at the house. It was as though it had flung her first at the gate, waiting for her to open it, and then lifted and thrown her, bag and all, at the front door. The watching children heard a terrific bang, and as she landed, the whole house shook. "How funny! I've never seen that happen before," said Michael. "Let's go and see who it is," said Jane. And taking Michael's arm, she drew him away from the window, through the nursery and out onto the landing. From there, they always had a good view of anything that happened in the front hall. Presently, they saw their mother coming out of the drawing room with a visitor following her. Jane and Michael could see that the newcomer had shiny black hair. "Rather like a wooden Dutch doll," whispered Jane, and that she was thin, with large feet and hands, and small, rather peering blue eyes. "You'll find they are very nice children," Mrs. Banks was saying. Michael's elbow gave a sharp dig at Jane's ribs. "And that they give no trouble at all," continued Mrs. Banks, uncertainly, as if she herself didn't really believe what she was saying. They heard the visitor sniff, as though she didn't either. "Now about references," Mrs. Banks went on. "Oh, I make it a rule never to give references," said the other firmly. Mrs. Banks stared. "But I thought it was usual," she said. I understood people always did." "A very old-fashioned idea to my mind," Jane and Michael heard the stern voice say. "Very old-fashioned. Quite out of date, as you might say." Now, if there was one thing Mrs. Banks did not like, it was to be thought old-fashioned. She just couldn't bear it. So she said quickly, "Very well then, we won't bother about references. I only asked, of course, in case you required it. The nursery's upstairs." And she led the way towards the staircase, talking all the time without stopping once. And because she was doing that, Mrs. Banks didn't notice what was happening behind her. But Jane and Michael, watching from the top landing, had an excellent view of the extraordinary thing the visitor now did. Certainly she followed Mrs. Banks upstairs, but not in the usual way. With her large bag in her hands, she slid gracefully up the banisters and arrived at the landing at the same time as Mrs. Banks. Such a thing Jane and Michael knew had never been done before. Down, of course, for they often done it themselves, but up? Never. They gazed curiously at the strange new visitor. "Well, that's all settled then." A sigh of relief came from the children's mother. "Quite, as long as I'm satisfied," said the other, wiping her nose with a large red and white bandana handkerchief. "Why, children," said Mrs. Banks, noticing them suddenly, "what are you doing there? This is your new nurse, Mary Poppins. Jane, Michael, say how do you do? And these," she waved her hand at the babies in their cots, "are the twins." Mary Poppins regarded them steadily, looking from one to the other as though she were making up her mind whether she liked them or not. "Will we do?" said Michael. "Michael, don't be naughty," said his mother. Mary Poppins continued to regard the four children searchingly. Then, with a long, loud sniff that seemed to indicate she'd made up her mind, she said, "I'll take the position." For all the world, as Mrs. Banks said to her husband later, as though she were doing us an honour. "Perhaps she is," said Mr. Banks, putting his nose round the corner of the newspaper for a moment, and then withdrawing it very quickly. When their mother had gone, Jane and Michael edged towards Mary Poppins, who stood still as a post with her hands folded in front of her. "How did you come?" Jane asked. "It looked just as if the wind blew you here." "It did," said Mary Poppins briefly, and she proceeded to unwind her muffler from her neck and to take off her hat, which she hung on one of the bedposts. As it didn't seem as though Mary Poppins was going to say any more, though she sniffed a great deal, Jane too remained silent. But when she bent down to undo her bag, Michael could not restrain himself. "What a funny bag," he said, pinching it with his fingers. Carpet, said Mary Poppins, putting her key in the lock. To carry carpets, you mean? No, made of. Oh, said Michael, I see. But he didn't quite. By this time the bag was open, and Jane and Michael were more than surprised to find it was completely empty. Why, said Jane, there's nothing in it. What do you mean, nothing? Demanded Mary Poppins, drawing herself up and looking as though she'd been insulted. Nothing in it, you say? And with that, she took out from the empty bag a starched white apron and tied it round her waist. Next, she unpacked a large cake of Sunlight soap, a toothbrush, a packet of hairpins, a bottle of scent, and a small folding armchair and a box of throat lozenges. Jane and Michael stared. But I saw, whispered Michael. I'm sure it was empty. Hush, said Jane, as Mary Poppins took out a large bottle labelled 1 teaspoon to be taken at bedtime. A spoon was attached to the neck of the bottle, and into this Mary Poppins poured a dark crimson fluid. Is that your medicine? Inquired Michael, looking very interested. No, yours, said Mary Poppins, holding out the spoon to him. Michael stared. He wrinkled up his nose. He began to protest. I don't want it. I don't need it. I won't. But Mary Poppins' eyes were fixed upon him, and Michael suddenly discovered that you couldn't look at Mary Poppins and disobey her. There was something strange and extraordinary about her, something that was frightening and at the same time most exciting. The spoon came nearer. He held his breath, shut his eyes and gulped. A delicious taste ran round his mouth. He turned his tongue in it. He swallowed, and a happy smile ran round his face. Strawberry ice, he said ecstatically. More, more, more. But Mary Poppins, her face as stern as before, was pouring out a dose for Jane. It ran into the spoon, silvery, greeny, yellowy. Jane tasted it. Lime juice cordial, she said, sliding her tongue deliciously over her lips. But when she saw Mary Poppins moving towards the twins with the bottle, Jane rushed at her. Oh no, please, they're too young. It wouldn't be good for them, please. Mary Poppins, however, took no notice, but with a warning, terrible glance at Jane, tipped the spoon towards John's mouth. He lapped it up eagerly, and by the few drops that were spilt on his bib, Jane and Michael could tell that the substance in the spoon this time was milk. Then Barbara had her share, and she gurgled and licked the spoon twice. Mary Poppins then poured out another dose and solemnly took it herself. Rum punch, she said, smacking her lips and corking the bottle. Jane's eyes and Michael's popped with astonishment, but they weren't given much time to wonder, for Mary Poppins, having put the miraculous bottle on the mantelpiece, turned to them. Now, she said, Spit Spot, into bed, and she began to undress them. They noticed that whereas buttons and hooks had needed all sorts of coaxing from Katie Nana, for Mary Poppins they flew apart almost at a look. In less than a minute they found themselves in bed and watching by the dim light from the nightlight the rest of Mary Poppins's unpacking being performed. From the carpet bag she took out 7 flannel nightgowns, 4 cotton ones, a pair of boots, a set of dominoes, 2 bathing caps and a postcard album. Last of all came a folding camp bedstead with blankets and eiderdown complete, and this she set down between John's cot and Barbara's. Jane and Michael sat hugging themselves and watching. It was all so surprising. They couldn't find anything to say. But they knew, both of them, that something strange and wonderful had happened at number 17 Cherry Tree Lane. Mary Poppins, slipping one of the flannel nightgowns over her head, began to undress underneath it as though it were a tent. Michael, charmed by this strange new arrival, unable to keep silent any longer, called to her. Mary Poppins, he cried, you'll never leave us, will you? There was no reply from under the nightgown, and Michael couldn't bear it. You won't leave us, will you? He called anxiously. Mary Poppins's head came out from the top of the nightgown. She looked very fierce. One more word from that direction, she said threateningly, and I'll call the policeman. I was only saying, began Michael neatly, that we hoped you wouldn't be going away soon. He stopped, feeling red and very confused. Mary Poppins stared from him to Jane in silence. Then she sniffed. I'll stay till the wind changes, she said shortly, and she blew out her candle and got into bed. "That's all right," said Michael, half to himself and half to Jane. But Jane wasn't listening. She was thinking about all that had happened and wondering.